Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarakan. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by my friend, Rosa Burç, who is a political sociologist and postdoctoral researcher. Thank you for coming on the show, Rosa.
Thank you for inviting me, Elif. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. As we all are following, there's quite significant developments taking place, actually, literally all across Kurdistan. And there's much to follow and probably much to discuss. But I want to start by asking you about a very particular area, which is, often when people reference Kurdish movement or sometimes the Kurdish freedom movement, it's a reference to, or it's used to describe the movement, particularly around Abdullah Öcalan, and particularly in the last 20 years or so, the movement around democratic confederalism. You've spent years researching the Kurdish movement, some could say like from the inside, in terms of not just kind of the stated aims, but the social movement element of it, not just as a military phenomena or a geopolitical puzzle. Whether people agree with it or not, the Kurdish movement is understood as a transformative ideology. Yet most people, particularly in the West, but actually not limited to, encounter the Kurdish movement through one of three lenses, it seems, still till this day. The brave fighters who beat ISIS, the geopolitical pawns caught between bigger powers, or the women with Kalashnikovs who make great magazine covers. None of these, of course, get to the substance of the matter. What do people most misunderstand about the Kurdish freedom movement?
Thank you for this question. And I think we are at the core of, what has been misunderstood maybe or misinterpreted or maybe narrowed down in a, quite difficult way all around the Kurdish question, so-called Kurdish question, because of course we are talking about the Kurdish movement now, but the Kurdish movement is embedded within the, regional and international Kurdish question. It is one large actor that is very much embedded within societies across the region. And here we are at the core of the issue, actually. Most of the time, the Kurdish movements or mobilizations in Kurdistan are not only locked or narrowed down to what you said about, the securitization narrative of, a military armed organization fighting a nation state, or like, as you said, the female fighters who, resonated globally, but often in a quite superficial way because they were, portrayed with guns, women fighting patriarchy on the battlefield against ISIS, etc. But none of these frames about the Kurdish movement had an understanding of a long legacy of resistance in Kurdistan and a long legacy of resistance in the wider region that is not limited to the nation-state borders that we are dealing with. And I think one of the largest and one of the most misread situations, or let's say the lack of understanding Kurdish mobilization fully, is that not maybe those who research it, but the international and also the public oftentimes limits their analysis not only within the borders of the nation states Kurds inhabit, but also from a state-centered perspective. So they center the interest, the self-positionality, let's say, of Ankara, of Damascus, of Tehran, and Baghdad over what the society on the ground actually mobilizes for and how they locate themselves in their imaginaries, in their practices, etc. And this was something that I was dealing with throughout my research because I felt it was oftentimes during my research process, actually, in colloquia or, by professors working on social movements, they would tell me to maybe limit my analysis, for instance, to Turkey. and to see how the Kurdish movement operates in Turkey, or to limit it to Syria or to Iraq, or to even do a comparative, research design of those nation states. But this was really misleading, I think, and this is one of the most misleading analytical errors we do in separating Kurdistan from Kurdistan, in fact, and to not see how intertwined even the movements, the mobilizations, and the way violence and statelessness is perceived by those communities.
I mean, I want to get back to particularly what you said, because I think you touched on a very important point there, particularly in the context of, essentially an attempt to redesign the Middle East once again, right? Of, basically matters being limited to or confined to certain nation state borders. And, what particularly some of the social movements in the context of Kurdistan could offer as a universal perhaps project. But before we get to that, because obviously that's a whole area in itself, you also spoke about, one of the kind of I suppose limiting narratives that is often associated with, let's say for the sake of argument, the Kurdish question, one of them being the security question. You know, we've also seen, and Kurdish leaders in the context of the peace process between, the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, and the Turkish state have spoken about the limitations of the process in terms of, you know, the Kurd seemingly, let's call it for the sake of argument, the Kurdish side approaching it as a question of democracy, and then the Turkish state approaching as a question of security. Do these particularly international narratives actually contribute to or inhibit or actually like become obstacles to peace in certain contexts when there is an attempt to democracy? So I guess in a more of a brief way, is the Turkish state able to still treat this as a security question because the international narrative also still maintains that limitation?
Absolutely. I think the Kurdish question is up until today limited on the security frame, and it is framed as a security question. And also the international, including Turkey, they're quite aware that there needs to be a response, a solution to that. But the way they offer a solution is in fact through the notion of integration, but not as in the form of the Kurdish movement's framing, as you also mentioned, democratic integration, quote unquote, because they call it a democratic integration in post-Assad Syria, as well as in Turkey with the peace process, meaning that they want to also change and transform the state and the state apparatus and the institutions towards a much more inclusive and democratic constitutional setting in the country. And it is a remaking and redrawing and a rebuilding of a state from the Kurdish perspective, including solutions to equal citizenship, etc. But on the international side, or I mean, also Turkey, and we also saw with like Germany meeting with, or also in England meeting with the interim president al-Shara, how the frame was still, pushed in the direction of in integration actually needs to kind of deliver some sort of stability. And stability, however, does not entail democratization processes from their perspective. And historian Hamid Bozarslan actually makes a three-pillar description of how the Turkish state approaches the peace process. He says, on the one hand, they try to reframe the Kurdish question as this is Hamid Bozarslan's analysis. He says they try to reframe the Kurdish issue as a national issue, as like a Turkish issue. Then in terms of, integrating the Kurdish subject into a larger Turkish subject.
Mm.
And then also on the second dimension, they still insist on framing it as a terrorist issue, like terrorism issue. So the peace process in Turkey is called the process of a terror-free Turkey, for instance. And on the third level, they reframe fraternity and brotherhood, etc., Kurdish Turkish brotherhood under the idea of a united ummah. So there is a lot of homogenization processes that we see on the side of the international and international actors like Europe, Germany, UK, but also interim government in Syria or in Turkey, trying to actually, in a way, deal with the Kurds, not in terms of an intrinsic motivation to democratize the country or the region, and to build in that way stability for all the segments of society, but to basically frame it as an integration process within the already existing frameworks, but without, and this is the change, like the new, let's say, dimension or the new development, without denying the existence of Kurds was one of the main reasons of systematic violence against Kurds in the past 100 years. But now they cannot deny their existence, but try to integrate it into a homogeneous remaking of the nation in Syria and in Turkey.
I mean, and in this context, one of the biggest steps that kind of led by Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK has taken is to effectively dissolve itself. Fighters burn their weapons in a symbolic ceremony and have withdrawn from points within the borders of Turkey. And there is that contribution to a transition to the democratic integration that you describe as well. But there still does, as you said, remain a question. When fighters who've lived in the mountains for decades are told to come down and integrate into a Turkish state that imprisoned, tortured, and killed their fellows, what possibilities are there, in terms of what can the guerrilla become when the guerrilla lays down their arms?
Yes, I have to say the call, I mean, last year's call by Abdullah Öcalan and then the ceremony that you described, burning 30 weapons in a very symbolic ceremony, laying down arms, and actually to make a call into the world as one of the most militant organizations that history maybe has seen, to say we are militants of peace. Basically, we are ready to build peace, and I think this is a super radical move by the PKK, I have to say, and it comes in a very counterintuitive moment in time because the world is, militarizing and global wars are entrenching, authoritarianism is everywhere, and states are very much intrigued to start wars and to go back to quite primitive, let's say, ways of dealing with each other. And in that moment of time, one of the guerrilla movements, one of the largest guerrilla movements have declared a will for peace by laying down arms. And I think it could be maybe the most radical reinvention of the PKK and of the Kurdish movement. Not because I mean, it was a symbolic disarmament, right? So there is a declaration of will, and the ceremony was quite symbolic. However, what it kind of delivered was to say weapons are not an emancipatory item anymore. So we need to build a more, let's say, democratic society, and weapons can be in the way if we want to be honest, let's say. But this is nothing that, I mean, you said, what happens with the guerrilla afterwards? This decision to lay down arms, to me, as someone who has studied the Kurdish movement around the PKK and Öcalan's political thought, for me, it came as a very organic and quite natural development, and something that was to be anticipated in a way, because the movement has in the past already shifted its narrative from revolutionary violence in the sense of Frantz Fanon to much more self-defense as, the only way violence should be applied. Because I mean, the idea was to find ways, or to be reflective about the fact that if there is a monopoly of violence, there is a very slippery slope to actually mimic state violence. And in order to distinguish themselves from the monopoly of the state, there was a transformation also of the concept of violence within the PKK in the past 20 and 30 years. And now to lay down arms and to shift the gravity of revolutionary transformation to building a society and to say we have already started, we have already a practice that is rooted in building a society. Maybe we can talk about that later. Now it kind of materializes with a call to say we have to lay down arms. However, in order to also respond to your question, this is all linked to the necessity, and this is also declared by the PKK and also by Abdullah Öcalan, necessity of the Turkish state to provide the framework that makes a disarmament possible. So the Kurdish side is ready to be militant defenders of peace by laying down their arms and to start an integration process into the society, which means people who have been in the mountains for many years should be able to return to their countries, to their land, which in fact then most of the time is, for instance, Turkey, without having to face a long sentence, prison sentences, etc. And also with the commission in Turkey that actually should provide the framework to make this peace process and the, let's say, dissolvement of the PKK possible. We only see that on the Turkish side, with the commission not being really capable of actually providing the legal framework for this kind of peace, that on the Turkish side, we have a very strategic approach and tactical approach to peace in terms of trying to survive in the midst of a Middle East that is being redesigned, with the idea that making peace with the Kurds might also help the existential crisis inside Turkey and for Turkey. But on the Kurdish side, we have a very dedicated will to end conflict and to make a sign in the atmosphere of militarization globally to lay down arms.
Mm. I mean, you've also argued that the movement's politics goes beyond the Kurdish question, that, democratic autonomy is an attempt to resolve a democratic deficit that exists in, liberal nation states everywhere, from other parts of the Middle East to Europe and, other parts of the world as well. So actually, to talk a bit more about, I suppose, society in that context is when we talk about this, is this just a Kurdish project or is it a universal one? And additionally, does its success, or for its success, does it necessitate its universalization, even if it's just in the Middle East?
Mm. Well, I mean, it is both. I think the Kurdish issue or Kurdish mobilization always has a dual dimension. It speaks to the world because it has understood and has unpacked the systems of violence and domination that are, that you can find across the world. I mean, being patriarchy, capitalism, or ecocide, etc. But at the same time, it also renegotiates constantly and reproduces constantly the conditions where Kurdishness can also become a subjectivity of its own. And I think so it is both. It is the Kurdish question. So the Kurdish mobilization is basically speaks to the Kurdish question. At the same time, it speaks globally. It transforms the Kurdish question the way it was perceived many, many years as a territorial question, as a security question, as a national question. And it says, in fact, having a nation state in the classical sense might not even contribute so much to the concept of freedom, not to the concept of sovereignty, but to the concept of freedom. And in that moment of ideological transformation, you have the moment where it transcends Kurdistan as a sphere. And I think this is the moment where it speaks to many, many other struggles across the world. Also, given that this was also part of one quite central pillar of my work, to say in this time of catastrophe, of Anthropocene, of the end of the world in a way, the Kurdish movement has internalized violence and the concept of violence so much, or the activists who are part of the Kurdish movement, that they know that, establishing a state will not solve the issue of violence because violence is within society. It is also not only within society, it is within ourselves, the way we look at ourselves, let's say. So revolutionary transformation for the Kurdish movement has been to restructure and rebuild and find antitheses to the fracturing of society that states are pursuing across the world. And I think this is something that really made it possible for Kurdish activists, but also for other activists across the world, feminists, ecological activists, or also other oppressed societies to resonate with the idea that kind of was born within the Kurdish movement. And we saw this very, very strongly, not only, I mean, there are different kind of alliances and solidarities, but one of the most materialized ways was in the Jinjian Azadi movement, where it was able to transcend in one context of conflict, Jinjian Azadi, to another context of conflict, and it became an emancipatory slogan and an emancipatory practice of societal transformation. So the Kurdish movement has basically in my work, I call it survivance path of mobilization, because in social movement studies, you try to understand why people mobilize, and
Mm,
there are different paths of mobilization, motivational, biographical, different kinds of mobilizational motivations, let's say. But what I saw on the ground and talking to people, there was a very internalized, as I said, notion of survival against all the layers, multi-layered crises and catastrophes and violences that they had to endure as being, Kurds, persecution, or, all the kind of, all the history.
mm,
So there was a very internalized notion of that
mm,
survival is always part of resistance. So bringing together the notion of survival and resistance is one of the, I think, motivational aspects or paths to be part of, Kurdish mobilization, to feel mobilized, because it is always at the intersection of survival amid violence and at the same time resisting for a future and for the here and now and building something alternative within the context of, statelessness or borderscapes or, yeah, violence, as I said. And I think this really speaks to many, many societies across the world, especially given the climate crisis and the catastrophic, times that we live in with the wars globally.
mm. I mean, what you just described in terms of the approach of the both in the Kurdish context, but also the universal aspect of the Kurdish movement's approach, or the Kurdish movement that is around Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK, particularly in the context of some of the developments in Rojava. It seems that some took it as an opportunity to really, I guess, encourage a different, actually a very different nationalist line, which is to say, actually, the Kurdish freedom must necessarily be anti-universal or this anti-universalism. And some have argued, I read an article recently that, that line, which is represented by certain parties and so on in the context of Kurdistan, they don't necessarily have a vision themselves. This is the argument of the article. They don't necessarily have a vision themselves, but just, aim to oppose this universal vision and, what they have called like the siblinghood of the peoples and, talking about how that is just simply not possible. And others have argued that actually that is the only way freedom would be possible. How do you see this, I guess, rise of this nationalist line, which, also some argue is very embedded in opposing a very particular part of the Kurdish movement line, which is the line in terms of women's liberation. How do you read this, this rise in I guess what we could call that camp?
Yes, I mean it is very concerning, in my opinion, to have that rise. And but at the same time, I can see where it comes from because the context of violence and the threat of like the existential threat that we experienced now only a few weeks ago with the attacks on Aleppo, on the Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo, and everything that is happening in Syria and in Rojava, and also now with the Iran war, Kurdistan being in the middle of everything. I understand that in times of increasing violence, international violence and geopolitical violence, that there might be the instinct or the intuition to say, well, protection can only be provided if we have our own nation state, and everything else is secondary. And this has actually been very much the case in the history. I mean, in history, nationalist movements have always prioritized national liberation through statehood by making other, societal liberations and societal questions a secondary or not even one of the issues that are necessary to address. And the Kurdish movement was very distinct in that way. And I argue that the reason why it survived across all the episodes of violence in the past 50 years, or even longer, but 50 years since the armed struggle, the reason why it was able to survive is to decenter the notion of liberation from the nationalist frame. Because nationalism narrows down imagination, and nationalism is very much intertwined with patriarchy and intertwined with the notion of power, hierarchy. And I think it eventually, like necessarily, it leads to unfree notions of how we imagine society. And it's a trap, I would say. It's a trap that it feels like the most natural response that one could deliver to the systems of violence right now. But in fact, looking at the history, the Kurdish movement was so successful in the moment it addressed the heterogeneous society that they were operating with, and in the moment it kind of recentered the moment of colonialism from state society into within society to kind of mark the beginning of colonialism in the colonization of the women in society. The Kurdish movement was able to transcend and to be adopted in so many different places across Kurdistan and beyond that it was able to survive. And I mean, the movement in itself was able to survive despite being surrounded by in a very hostile environment. And it is one of the cases where you see that narrow nationalism not necessarily leads to freedom and not necessarily leads to victory. And I want to add one more thing because it is something that really I mean I keep on thinking about the national question more and more the past months for especially. And I think it's not really a contradiction. I mean, we should be also, I'm not talking about like narrow nationalism, but to think about the national question is part of the deliberation in and around Rojava, for instance, because what is being negotiated now with Damascus or Ankara is not only the future of Syria or Turkey or Iran in that case, but it is also the future of Kurdistan. So I think we should also be, I mean, those who are critical of nationalism should also be kind of more comfortable in addressing the question of the national question more and more, and maybe to actually use that moment of design to also progress with the idea of the national question into a new direction. The national question not necessarily has to be intertwined with patriarchy and capitalism, as in the very classical sense, let's say. And I think maybe this is also a moment for us to rethink and to offer a new way to think about the national question in Kurdistan. And I think so we should also be more comfortable in talking about it. But I do see it as a very concerning development that those voices sometimes dominate the discourse.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that, you know, basically the national question doesn't have to be nationalism. And actually, the more we engage with the national question, the more some of these, you know, I suppose, as you would describe it, concerning, nationalist camps actually perhaps will become less and less loud, or will feel like they can be less loud. I mean, as I said in asking that question, it seemed that that narrow nationalist camp took a lot of ammunition from the developments in the last few months, particularly in Rojava. And you've written about Rojava's project, but also in the last few months, the Rojava's survival. Like what a lot of people have spoken about what that survival means. A lot of people have catastrophized to say, well, it's done now. We must go for another we must go for another kind of, I guess, approach. And but also there is, as we talk, there is also, I think it's as we're speaking, the YPG, so the women's protection units, are in their first ever, after a lot of effort and after a lot of essentially waiting, in their first integration talks with the Syrian interim government. So in that context, in the context of, the those in Rojava having to deal with Ahmed al-Shara, also known as Muhammad al-Jolani, with this, very fundamentalist jihadi, well, some say past, some say continued present. In that context, can, particularly as an alternative project, can Rojava survive, and what could that survival look like?
Mhm. I think, I mean, the question of Rojava's survival is a very difficult and a painful question, I have to say, because there are many things. There is territorial loss within these negotiations, but there's also, the loss of accomplishments like the women's liberation and the situation of minoritized communities within the region. So there is a lot at risk, not only for the territorial enclave that, I mean, that is now at the disposition, I mean, the Western Kurdistan and Rojava, etc. But it also is at risk for whatever future holds for the region in its entirety. So you have a situation where if this negotiation fails, if the democratic integration fails, with like the accomplishments of the women's revolution in Rojava, there is a very bitter and very dark future for Syria coming. And I think people across the world should be quite aware of, if you advocate for Rojava in this particular moment in time, you're advocating for the last resort before a very, very dark period. I mean, for the last solution that maybe Rojava's accomplishments could have an effect on a future Syria. Because otherwise, you might have to imagine there is a society that has been operating on terms of equality, on terms of women's liberation. They have, systematized women's participation in society, in the politics. Women are visible in Rojava. And on the other hand, you have a model that kind of proclaims to have a solution to be the democratic president for the future with Sharia, although that he has no democratic legitimacy so far. But all the talks and all the discourses kind of exclude the issue that it is one of the central issues whether or not the women's revolution's accomplishments will be integrated into a new constitution in Syria. And I think this will be a very, very difficult period. And it's more than important that across the world, everyone who has an interest in a democratic Middle East should be advocating for a democratic integration of Rojava into the new Syrian state because of the role of women and the accomplishments of the past 10 to 15 years with like minoritized communities.
I mean, speaking about, that kind of like, I guess what would be needed for a democratic Middle East, particularly as we've discussed today. in the context of a very clear attempt to redesign the Middle East 100 years after one of its initial redesigns, or its, I suppose, redesign in the post, I suppose, empire era. you know, you've written a lot about how the Kurdish movement builds society in times of violence. That obviously seems very present, particularly in the context of Rojava, so East Kurdistan, the northwest of Iran. And there really is a context here that, the Kurds or the Kurdish people there have been treated as this homogenous entity that, basically can merely support one side's victory rather than actually there being a societal element there. And, a lot of Kurdish forces, those who may not even be ideologically aligned with the Kurdish freedom movement, have effectively taken a stance that could be described as the third way. So not standing with any main side here, whether it's the Iranian regime or the US Israel bloc. Looking beyond that though, looking beyond that, very kind of generalized geopolitical description, what are people missing here when it comes to society? Whether that's the left or the right across the West, what are people missing in terms of society, and what can you tell us about, what what may survive if and when, if it was to happen that, there was a context in which, like what happened in Rojava, the state in Iran withdraws from some of those areas.
I think what you have described about in Rojalat being, constituting a third alternative to what is proposed, this has been one of the most characteristic, most common characteristics of Kurdish movements. I use the plural, Kurdish movements across the world, across the region, because the options that are always offered are quite, dominant options. In Turkey, we have it as, the Kemalist, back to the Kemalist era, or like AKP with, with a more, let's say, Islamic narration of the nation as like two options. And then also in Turkey, we had the situation that the Kurdish movement then was forced to take sides. In Syria, this was the case before Rojava as an entity actually was established, because in Rojava, the Kurdish movement was first part of the opposition. They were first part of the opposition against Assad, and then they kind of developed out of there to build, this semi-autonomous entity in the northeast, known as Rojava, because of ideological differences, because the opposition against Assad was offering not really a democratic alternative to the situation, to the dictatorship under Assad. And we have a quite similar situation here in Iran, where Kurds are most often portrayed, and maybe going back to your very first question about, media portrayal, also here we see how Kurds are most often portrayed as a boot, like the troops, the troops of someone, as proxies that you can just use in order to, win a side or something. And this is one of the most common narrations about Kurds in the Middle East, and it's almost a myth of, Kurds would be working on the side of the imperial forces, or you could just buy them, just using it symbolically. You can, the term, you can maybe use them, instrumentalize them against a regime, etc. The Kurds have an intrinsic interest in a democratization in the countries they live in, because they are systematically oppressed by the systems that have been ruling and that are currently ruling. In Iran, it would be the monarchy in the past, and now the theocracy in the present. And in both cases, Kurds have been oppressed. So there is no interest. There is a very intrinsic interest of Kurdish actors to actually find a solution for their own oppression. So this is what I have to say about it. I think most of the time there is a distorted betrayal of the Kurds not aligning with one side, but in fact, they are always offering a third alternative where they say, well, the systems that have been ruling the region or this country for the past 100 years are not systems that actually provide some sort of freedom, liberties, a democracy, and a vision for the future. Let's build something together where we do not deny the existence of each other's existence, basically. And this is also the core element of the society building frame of the Kurdish movement, to recognize each other in each other's distinct positionality, and then to have a consensual way of thinking about society. But I will not be, to be also quite honest, I think what we see in Syria, very particular, with the loss of territory, might seem like something that could not maybe really impact the Kurdish movement and how it operates, because it has already shown that it is able to reinvent itself and reproduce itself. However, territory also is something where ideas materialize. So I think the loss of territory in Rojava, or these kind of very, very dangerous situations also with Iran and Turkey, might have an effect as a setback in the way Kurdish accomplishments and Kurdish, ideas have been successful in the past. But I wouldn't say that the future is so dark. I think the past has shown that despite everything, despite all the periods of violence and oppressions, the Kurdish movement was able to reinvent itself, adopt in a new context of conflict, because it decenters the state and because it always gravitates around the question of dignity. And I think this is one of the core principles of all the third alternatives the Kurdish movements across the region are offering.
Mm, mm. Thank you so much for your time and for your
Thank you, Elif.
effort and for your thoughts. We obviously could talk for hours and hours, and there is so much to talk about, and I'm sure we will talk again. But thank you so much for your time today, Rosa.
Thank you for your questions. It was lovely to see you.
So good to talk to you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.